All right. So as summer is quickly approaching and people are planning on getting together with friends and family and spending time outdoors, I thought it would be good to have a conversation about the exterior spaces around your home, outdoor living, gathering spaces, landscaping, and some general principles that you can use to make your yard and your space better. So joining me today is landscape architect Nicholas Campanelli, who is an associate principal and a partner at MDLA based out of Boston and Glastonbury, Connecticut. Nick, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
So, why don't we start off by having you tell a little bit about yourself and how you got started in landscape architecture?
Yeah, so to kind of go way back, I'm 40 years old, so I don't know. I'll call it mid-range into the profession at this point. But going back to growing up, my dad owned a landscape contracting business in northern Connecticut. So, to me, that was kind of where this all started. I mentioned that specifically because the 6 or 7 years of working with him allowed me to have a clear understanding of the use of materials and really the limitations in design in installation for materials, which I've been using to this day across
Yeah.
multiple markets in landscape architecture. Once I went off to college, I have a degree from Penn State University in landscape architecture, graduated 2007. From there, went down to Washington, D.C., worked for a large land planning firm. From there, I moved up to Boston. That focuses more on urban design, streetscapes, roof decks, parks, projects of that nature. From there, moved back to Connecticut. Once I proposed to my wife, got married, decided to start a family, joined up with a large architectural multidisciplinary practice. Focus there was a lot on higher ed, university work, private schools, public education. So you can start to see there's a wide variety of project scales
Hmm.
that I've been involved with. Again, I was trying to basically see what I liked, right? That's kind of the point of bouncing around. So in 2020, I partnered with Mike D'Angelo of Michael D'Angelo Landscape Architecture, MDLA LLC, based out of Boston and Glastonbury, as you mentioned earlier. And what that allowed is essentially to bring everything that we like from the profession into our own practice, right? So we're a multidisciplinary or a multi-market landscape architecture firm. I know we're here to discuss residential architecture, but we create contemporary landscapes for multifamily projects, corporate campuses, universities. We also do a bit of golf course architecture. So anything we can find that we enjoy working on, we're willing to take on. And then, to the point of today's conversation, a big portion of what we work on is residential work, high-end residential work. So complex detailing, complex materials. So looking forward to kind of diving into that a little bit as we get into this conversation.
Yeah, and I can imagine that experience with those multiple scales of projects, right? You could take things from urban planning and campus planning that has a lot to do with sort of placemaking and creating these individual moments, and you can bring that into the residential realm. I'd imagine, and especially the way that I see people using their residential sort of properties these days. It's not so much as just here's a swath of grass and maybe a little fire pit in the corner. People are really starting to plan out their lawns in a strategic way.
Yeah, it's, what I learned from particularly working in the higher ed market was, master planning. That's something I really enjoyed. And it's a when we engage clients, we'll dive into this a little more down the road in this conversation. But, to show the parallels from my previous experiences to what we're doing now and how it applies to residential design. When I walk a property with a client, they tend to be focused on the single project, the small project, what they want to bite off in that moment. As I look around, I look at long-term, short-term kind of opportunities for the project, for both the project and the client. That's something that I learned from working on higher ed projects, master planning projects at a large scale. So, those ideas and the ability to kind of think outside the box, on jobs, varied scales from high, large 100-acre campuses all the way down to 10, 15,000 square foot residential property. There's a lot of things that apply to both markets.
Yeah. So when someone wants to get started on a project, whether they're have an existing home that they want to create a better landscape in, or maybe they're renovating their home or build, or even better, building a brand new home, and they're really starting to consider what their landscaping is going to be like. What's it like to work with a landscape architect?
Yeah, so in general, if you're a residential client looking to work with a landscape architect, you're looking for, in my opinion, a higher standard of design than you might get from engaging a general contractor or a local contractor right off the bat. And
Hmm.
I think there's some efficiencies personally in hiring a landscape architect because we'll do a deep dive and we'll have a clear understanding of zoning restrictions. We'll work with contractors that in our network to provide budgeting along the way. So we try to, in an efficient way, move along the process. And I think that's really what residential clients look for when they engage landscape architects. It's no different than architecture. You hire a landscape architect, really, in my mind, because you're looking to design within a budget and within zoning restraints. You hire a specific landscape architect because of their design style, process, and relationships.
Yeah.
So to me, if you're looking or entertaining multiple landscape architects, you're probably looking at different styles and different processes to really get an understanding of who you ultimately want to work with.
Yeah, and just like working with an architect or an interior designer or even a contractor, I think that it's those relationships, right? You need to find someone that you get along with, that you not only really relate to their personal style and what they accomplish with their projects, but also someone that you can relate to and have a conversation with, because it's those deep conversations that's going to really bring out those special moments.
Yeah, and I think an overarching kind of theme of this conversation is collaboration, right?
Yeah.
I've never worked on a job where it's solely the landscape architect's project or solely the architect's project. It has to sing together, or with interior design, it has to ring together. The best projects work together. So, and I think that type of project is the ones we really want to be working on because ultimately those are the ones those are going to be streamlined for success.
And so I think, when I think of landscape architecture in a residential setting, unless you're lakefront or oceanfront, and I guess this applies to those properties as well, but it seems like there's always a few big moments that the design is focused around, whether that's a pool or an outdoor kitchen or, something of that nature. Can you talk a little bit about how you bring that to life and how do you use those as sort of drivers to design the rest of the property?
Yeah, sure. Over the past couple of years, I always go back to COVID because COVID really expedited
Oh, yeah, yeah.
the emphasis on residential design and really allowed people to really examine what their properties offered because when we were trapped at home you had no other choice but to experience your property, right?
Mhm.
That moment when COVID happened, that first year and a half, a lot of our residential projects really focused on creating the vacation in the backyard, whether it was the pool, outdoor kitchens, usable, flexible open space. That's really what the focus was. So, in that moment, that's really what the emphasis was across varied scales, small projects, large projects. But beyond that, when we work on a residential project, I always like to emphasize, getting the entire team, again, collaboration
Yeah.
involved early because you can look in a bubble and focus on a pool, but there's other opportunities where a landscape architect in collaboration with a civil engineer, architect, interior designer, et cetera, can work to enhance the entry sequence to a property. Or
Mhm.
if you're a ground up project, really help to position the house to maximize views, create that entry sequence, create a surprise. Don't just have a straight driveway that leads to the garage, for example.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think what you're talking about here, and which I also personally recommend, is hiring a landscape architect early on in the design
Yeah.
process. Right? You don't wanna wait till your house is under construction, or you don't wanna wait until the house is designed. I think you should hire the landscape architect early on as you're working with an architect and as that schematic design is coming together. You need to get those professionals in there, and involved early on in the process to have the most benefit, I think.
Yeah, yeah, and I think again, it really depends on the scale of the project. If say your house is established and it's purely a landscape project,
Mhm.
that's a
Yeah.
standalone. But I think for the sake of this conversation, we'll focus on that collaborative process, whether it's a renovation or a ground up build for residential. We want to be working side by side with the architect, and I'm sure you do as well, working with the
Mhm. Yeah.
landscape architect to find where the best place to locate that new home should be on a property. So to me,
Yep.
that's just as key as designing that very complex, very detailed pergola in the backyard. It's just at a different scale. It all starts basically large scale working down to small.
And as an architect, I might come to a new project and I might see a property and say, oh, the house might work really good here. And then we can plan out these different zones. But a landscape architect coming in might have a different perspective and a different view of things. And I think, when you have that collaboration and you can have those multiple professionals sort of bouncing ideas off of each other, I think the end result is going to be much better than if you were to sort of pigeonhole everyone and sort of say like, okay, the design's already done. What can you enhance now, right? Because at that point, it's more about just working within the constraints rather than being able to interject your opinions.
Yeah, and a big part of that too is cost, right? And a lot of times, clients don't necessarily want to bring the entire team on up front because of cost.
Yep.
But similar to the master plan conversation we can have later on, in my mind, the money spent up front, engaging all parties, ultimately creates the more efficient process, a more efficient project. And in the end,
Yep.
yeah, you're not trying to catch up. You're not trying to correct design moves that otherwise might have been thought about earlier in the process. So to me, that's money well spent, and typically, usually cuts off time on the project as well.
And then before we move on, I also want to touch upon the ability to implement sort of these higher end materials, that things that materials and design elements that you might know about that other professionals like myself or an interior designer or whatever might not know about or have access to.
Yeah, so the way I like to describe this is when you're doing a project on your own, probably leaning towards pavers, concrete, some basic materials.
Hmm.
When you bring in a landscape architect, I think inherently you're looking for more, I'll just say quality or an upgrade for what you think that space could be. This all ties in with budget. I think everything is tied in here, right? It's proposing with different materials, working with contractors to make sure the budget is being maintained.
Yep.
Because obviously, as you move from a paver or concrete to a porcelain tile to a bluestone or granite patio, obviously the cost goes up. But that's a conversation again that should be happening early in the process rather than later to kind of, the way we look at it, long story short, is we like to start with higher materials and then work back. No different than the architecture. You
Yeah.
work
Hmm.
what you want on the project until either supply demand, the materials aren't really available, or the budget really can't sustain having those materials. So that's really my job, is to push the boundaries within those budgets, within those zoning restraints, to maximize the value for your project.
And I'm sure you also have a great network of high-end landscape contractors that you can recommend for a project too. Just so if you're a homeowner and you're trying to do it yourself, or a homeowner and trying to, go out and get bids to do a new patio or something like that, you might just call up the local contractor, or maybe you get a couple of quotes and you choose the lowest, which I always say is the worst way to go about things.
Yep.
But when you involve the professional, they have the experience with those contractors that do that high end work, and the homeowner can feel, I guess, reassured that they're not gonna get taken for a ride, I guess, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think the key thing is that you can go with the lowest, but it's got to be the lowest qualified contractor,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
And that's a key word, because with the level of materials that are usually involved with on complex residential projects, that is a part of the interview process that's incredibly important prior to making a decision. We have, and most landscape architects, interior designers have a team of contractors that they
Hmm.
they they basically can finish each other's sentences, right? So again, getting involved early in the process, another theme of this conversation. When we develop concepts, we're working hand in hand with one or two contractors to budget that concept.
Yep.
That contractor might not necessarily win the bid to build the project, but the way we like to describe it to, residential client is like, well, we would like to work with a few contractors to budget it and appreciate the opportunity if you gave that contractor an opportunity to bid on the project. But again, it's working hand in hand with contractors through the beginning of the process, or starting at the beginning, working towards the end. Again, the more people we can get involved, the more familiar they're going to be with the project, the more efficient it's going to be, the more on budget it's going to be.
Yeah, and that just gets back to the collaborative aspect of things.
Mhm.
Bringing in a contractor as part of the team, along with the design professionals, is always
Yeah,
going to give you a better result.
sure.
So next thing I want to talk about is sort of these indoor outdoor spaces. People often say, blurring the lines between the indoors and the exterior. I think that's an overused buzzword, but it's a really important concept, right? And I think that adding a few windows doesn't necessarily create that connection, right? People think like, oh, I've got some big windows here that look out to my backyard. I've blurred the lines between the indoors and the outdoors. And I don't necessarily think that accomplishes that. So I wanted to talk to you about how can we create effective indoor outdoor spaces.
Yeah. So, I mean, blurring the lines, it is a bit of loaded term, but it's an important term. I got to work on a
Hmm.
project, whether it's a multifamily project, whether it's a higher ed, university project or residential, where that's not a key component to the design. So to me, it's like no different than sustainable design. It's kind of baked into every project at this point.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it's something that you bring up in interviews and mention it, but it's really just standard practice at this point. What type of connections? What you described earlier were visual connections, but
Hmm.
physical connections in my mind are just as important, right? It goes back to, you can start at the entry. How do you connect from start of the driveway to the front door? Where does that front door sit? Does the driveway engage the front door? Does it just pull around to the side of the house and a walkway takes you to the front door? Just upon the entry, there's a number of different ways to kind of skin the cat regarding connections. The same thing with the rear of the property or the side of the property, wherever an amenity space might be. How are you moving through the house out to the exterior environment? To me, those are important physical connections, both moving out and in from the exterior space, that are important, right? But visual connections, you mentioned the windows before, just as important. A lot of residential projects we work on, corridors are aligned with glazing at the end of the hallways to focus on vistas,
To
or
focus on it.
maybe a
Yeah.
piece of art
Yep.
beyond the window, right? Or like a vista beyond. So to me, you're not just dealing with the physical, but it's really I'll call it like the subconscious visual connection
Yep.
that you might not necessarily focus on, but maybe a visitor to the house would appreciate as they walk down a hallway, for example.
Yeah, there's these certain moments too that can happen. You can tell when they're really planned out. I was just looking at this design of this modern house recently, and cooking was a big aspect of the design, right? The
Yep.
design was focused around the act of cooking. And it was a large kitchen, right, with a large island, and the space between sort of the back wall of the countertops and cabinets and the island was aligned. That sort of zone where someone would stand when they're cooking, right,
Mhm.
was aligned directly with an oversized patio door. I think it was a French door with that it was at least an 8 foot tall door, maybe even taller, that opened up, and it was directly in line with the outdoor eating area. So as you're standing in the kitchen, that one moment of standing at the stove and turning your head and looking sort of down that aisle out the door to the outdoor dining area, and then to the landscape beyond. It was a really nice moment, right? And that's not something that happens on accident.
Yeah, it's all planned, and it's I kind of view moments as like little checkpoints in the way you migrate through a space too.
Yep.
So you probably move from there to that grill, the outdoor kitchen area, and then from there, like the view changes. I picture like a NCAA basketball tournament bracket in reverse, right? You start at one point, and then you get
Yeah.
out to like where that kitchen might be, and then
Yep.
two or three paths from there, you get out to there, and it keeps sprawling with options, right? But it's all thought through by the designers that are engaged.
Yeah, another thing that happens often is, in some homes you might have the rooms sort of like on the outside of the house, and the hallway down the middle, right? But a lot of times, especially in sort of modern homes, you might have the rooms pushed to one side and the hallways along the exterior wall, and that provides an opportunity to have, that sort of continuous glazing and have that sort of connection to that outdoor space, which is then planned in conjunction with that experience of sort of moving down that hallway.
Yeah, you're literally bringing the outdoor space into the hallway, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Maximizing the light.
One
Yeah.
of the one of the yeah, one of the things that I also really appreciate is when a landscape architect working with the contractors and the architects and the homeowners, they'll use the sort of the same materials and bring those materials in. You want to talk about creating a opening up and blurring the lines, right? If you can bring that sort of patio material, or maybe the wood element from a pergola, and then bring that in as a ceiling and use that on the interior of the home, and start to pull those materials on the inside to the inside of the house, I
Yeah.
think that really creates an even stronger connection.
Yeah.
Have
And
you ever done any projects that had that sort of situation?
yeah, we actually have one wrapping up in the next few weeks up in Lake Winnipesaukee, New Hampshire. Large residential project, which offers a lot of flexibility in what they can bite off. But the premise of what we're discussing here is exaggerated there. It's a really cool design solution that we collaborated with the architects on. So it's a lakefront property. We talked about glazing right before. the entire facade that faces the lake is lined with glazing. So the amount of natural light and the visual connections from the interior space out to that exterior environment and the views beyond to the lake are incredible.
Yeah.
So if you could picture, if you're inside one of the many rooms that face the lake, they all have a Nanowall system. And for those
Mhm.
of you that might not be familiar with it, it's basically like an accordion wall system that you can retract in and out. Basically, the entire facade opens
Yeah,
up.
the entire facade opens up. Yep.
Yeah. So, just with this specific location being in New Hampshire, obviously the warm season is short. The architects thought outside the box a little bit and provided two Nanowall systems, one outside on the lake, one inside of the house.
Oh, wow.
So if you picture a great room, is what they call the great room on the north
Yeah.
corner of the property, or north corner of the house. They have the opportunity during spring and fall months to open up the Nanowall that faces the lake and allow that the bluestone patio to pull into this great room, which also has a bluestone floor, so it literally feels continuous.
Oh, wow.
Or they could flip the thinking and close the outdoor walls and open the indoor walls, and it becomes an indoor space. So the amount of flexibility that's baked into design is pretty unique.
Yeah, that I've never seen that double nano wall system used before, but that sounds amazing.
Yeah,
'Cause
it's
like you
pretty
said,
brilliant.
you can open up that great room to the outside, and now it's part of the outside space, or
Yep.
you can open up the inside nano wall, and now it's part of the inside space. That's really, really nice.
Yeah, so there's a number of different, again, it all comes down to collaboration between interior designer, architect, and landscape architect to make sure the scale of the spaces feel consistent, the materiality of the spaces feel consistent, and
Yep.
just the general feel, right?
Do you have any other tips on those nano wall systems where it might not be a good idea to install them, or used improperly, right? Because I think sometimes like you open it up and then maybe it opens up too much, or maybe it allows sort of insects to sort of come
Yeah.
into your house.
Yeah, well, that's, in that application, that's something that did cross my mind in the talking with the client and even the architect. I think the intent in that specific moment is to use one or the other so that
Hmm.
the
Yeah.
house isn't entirely open to the elements. But in general, I know you and I discussed like bug repellent designs. In my mind, it's not necessarily, you can't do that without, I'll call it mechanical means, by putting like bug zappers off in the woods to draw
Yeah.
the attention away. But there are certain design elements in a landscape that you could use to like minimize the amount of insects. In general, they like moisture. So they like moisture, they like plants. So if bugs are an issue where you live, say you live adjacent to wetlands, for example, right? Where you live next to a wet property, designing a larger hardscape space that's not necessarily inviting for mosquitoes or bugs, basically providing a large hardscape space is going to do you more favors to deter
Hmm.
bugs than if, say, you had a small intimate space surrounded by plants. So there's scale and materiality that could be used to reduce the effect on bugs per se. We deal with deer a lot as well on projects, and there's
Oh, I bet.
specific deer love all these expensive plants we put on projects. so so working carefully with clients to balance what the aesthetic they want with the functional requirements to make sure that the installation succeeds is always, it's always a tricky balance.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's lots of people that want sort of to attract the pollinators as well, right? Or maybe
Yeah.
attract butterflies and
Yeah, to me, it's like one or the other. You want the bugs out,
yeah.
or you want the bugs in, right?
Yeah.
So, so the pollinator, gardens, whether you're putting in like a pepper bush or butterfly bush or clethra, I can name a number of different species for you to literally attract the bugs in. You get the good bugs, you get the bad bugs with the good bugs. So it's kind of, you kind of know what if you want to invite them in, you just got to realize that they're all coming together.
Yeah, so if bugs are an issue in your property and or you want to attract the quote unquote good bugs, and then you also want one of those nanowall systems, so you're saying like maybe have a larger hardscape area adjacent to the house, and then if you want those sort of insect attracting plants, or if you want more intimate smaller spaces, push it away, right?
That's how yeah, that'd be a basic recommendation. Yes.
Yeah. And that gets into again, like what we were talking about, like in the beginning, where it's not just like patio, pool, right? That sort of thing, just kind of like plop down in your yard. You really need to think sort of strategically about how
You
you're going to
do.
use your
Yeah,
space.
you do. You need to really, you just need an overall kind of comprehensive look at the property and make sure that like, functionality balances with program wants.
Hmm.
That's really what it comes down to.
What about shading? Because I know if you have those big, large hardscape spaces, that then you're probably not going to have sort of a lot of natural shading. So what do you use for shading both natural and man-made?
Yeah, shading's again another massive component to any project we work on, residential or commercial. It's whether you're doing it with natural features such as trees or man-made elements such as pergolas or umbrellas. There's a number of different ways to provide the shade without making it look like it's an afterthought. That's really the
Yeah.
intent, creating a design that's really comprehensive and, I say inclusive, use that with accessibility, but it's really inclusive when it comes to all the design elements. So if it's really thought through, you'll be in the shade, but you won't realize that it's done intentionally.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
yeah.
You
The way-
you know what? So you know what I always get a kick out of is when I see sort of these DIY pergolas,
Yep.
and they'll be over like a outdoor dining table, and it's placed sort of directly above the table, and then the
Yep.
shade is like 10 feet off to the side, and everyone's in the sun.
Yeah, well, that same job up in New Hampshire, I can't tell you how many rounds of shade studies we did on umbrellas and canopies that come off the house to make sure during peak hours, peak sun hours, they're getting the shade they want. So
Yeah.
it's an important part of any project.
And
Even, if you're putting a pool in your backyard, obviously you do that because you want the sun, but you do want the ability around that pool to have the ability to be under shade.
oh, exactly. If you're
Yeah,
having a party, right, out at your pool, maybe some people wanna lay it out in the sun, but I think most people are gonna want try to find whatever shade they can to sit
yeah,
on.
yeah,
And I think the point that you made about being in the shade, but not realizing that it was intentional is a really important thing, because that example I said of the pergola where the shades, 10 feet off the table, right? If you were to sort of correct that and place an umbrella, which is now sort of awkwardly placed off to the side of the table to get the table in the shade, that that doesn't look good, right? It
yeah. I
doesn't
mean,
look good. It might be effective in providing some shade, but that's not designed, right? And I think the services that you can provide is making those shading opportunities sort of look natural.
yeah, and again, coming back to collaboration, right? You could work with the architect as well. This is me being a landscape architect, working with the architect to position exterior spaces tight to the architecture in select locations that maximize shade as well, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Use the structure to provide the shade again. So when you're in it, you're in the shade during, peak hours, depending on solar orientation, but you don't, it's not intentional. It doesn't feel like it was an afterthought. You don't have that awkward umbrella, like you mentioned before, kind of sitting in the patio.
What about like designing sound in these outdoor spaces?
Yeah, sound is, again, this is all like subliminal, right? It's everybody loves water. If you live by the
Mhm.
water, it's calming, right? If you live by the ocean, you live by a lake. If you don't have a property that's on the lake or it's on the ocean, water features can provide the same calming effects. So, whether it's a pool or literally just a water feature, a water fountain out in the backyard, or
Mhm.
even upon the front entry. If you're looking at your kitchen towards a water element, there's a sense of calming. And obviously, if there's a water feature, you get that sound, right? The same thing can be accomplished with a fireplace. We've been doing a lot of fire tables or fire boulders lately.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah.
yeah, literally had a call last week with a client where he said that he enjoyed the crackling of the fire against the
Yeah.
stones that were inside the fireplace.
Yeah.
So, it's the things that I'd be lying if I said that wasn't intended with the design, but it's like a side kind of effect of the design that we put in place for it. So,
Yes. And then also, not only those sort of natural sounds, the water and the fire and that sort of stuff, but also music, right? I'm sure you have to
yep.
get into do you get into, designing where sort of any, like, outdoor speakers might be placed, or do you work with an audio engineer on that?
Yeah, we do. Yes. So again, the goal is to have the sound, but you don't want to see
Yep.
the sound,
Yeah,
right?
exactly, yeah.
It's no different than in the architecture where we're starting to hide speakers inside walls, literally make
Mhm.
them disappear. We do the same on the exterior environment, whether it's lighting or speakers. The goal is to provide the function of the lights and the sound. Well, you don't want to see them. So,
Yeah.
we're trying to hide lights under benches, under soffits where we can. Really, we don't want to be seeing low level lighting stakes. We don't want to be seeing large pole fixtures, large bollards, really trying to make it feel more pedestrian, particularly in the residential world. And that really ties back to, the speakers too that you'd mentioned earlier, where there's some big speakers that you can install on some of these properties.
Mhm.
It really comes down to color as well. We will never recommend a light color, light fixture speaker, etc., because your eye is drawn to it. Always go with
Yeah,
darker colors. It makes it just recede into the landscape.
exactly. Yeah.
And you can see that, subconsciously, if you drive around and look at fencing, if you see a black fence or a brown fence, it tends to recede in the landscape
Hmm.
and your eye tends to focus on what's around it versus if you have like a white PVC fence, your eye
Yeah.
goes to the fence and not what's around it. So it's the same idea with, I'll call it the accessories for exterior installations.
Oh yeah, yeah. I get that with the fencing, right?
Yeah.
I recently put a new fencing around my pool, and I actually stained it a really really dark blue. It's so
Yeah.
dark blue it's almost black. And people's like, "Oh, why didn't you paint it white?" I was like, "Well, I don't want the focus to be on the fence.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't want people looking at the fence. I want people looking at the pool."
Yeah. We're making, not to sidebar into a different market, but we're wrapping up a large project down at the Fairfield Beach Club right now, a commercial project
Yeah.
where the architecture's white, all of the existing fence is white, and we did a master plan for them about 2 years ago. And phase one is about to be complete, but a major component of that is changing all of the exterior fencing. Again, we're going to do this phase by phase
Hmm.
to black.
Yeah.
And the goal on this is to increase the visibility from the interior of the space out to the water. They want to
Yeah.
increase the water views.
Yeah.
So we're doing that not by using glass, but it's simply by changing the color of the fence. So your eye doesn't focus on the fence, it focuses
Through the fence. Yeah.
through the fence out to the view beyond. And that's something that crosses any market we work in.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many different ways that you can go with fencing that we could have a whole conversation just on that.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
When we were talking about materials earlier, like paver materials, but also sort of wall and ceiling materials, I wanted to talk a little bit about texture. What are your sort of approaches to different textures of materials?
Yeah, so like the texture and the type of materials we use really is determined, in our mind by the programming that's around it. So for example, if you have a pool,
Hmm.
you don't want slip, you want slip resistant materials around the pool. So we'd never
Yep.
reckon like porcelain tile or a thermal bluestone,
Yeah.
right? So there's certain materials that you want to stay away from in certain applications. You move away from that pool, we've used porcelain, we've used thermal bluestone for stairs, for patios. Great application. You just got to use it in the right location. Another thing with texture too, similar to the fence, if depending on the type of material and how rough that material is, it's actually something that you can pick up on or visitors can pick up on as they walk across the space.
Hmm.
So we've used reclaimed granites. If you picture in your mind like a granite curb turned on its side,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
yeah, taken from a street, it's rougher. You lay that on its side and run that across a patio. As you're walking across it, you can feel the variation in the material. It
Uh
actually
huh.
it actually gets you to focus on the ground plane a little
Yeah.
more and pay attention to the materiality of the space, versus if it was
I could
smooth.
imagine that that would be useful in sort of areas where it might be you might need to pay attention, like if you're walking down like a steep slope or something like that.
Exactly. Like the rougher materials, it really comes down to where your property is as well. Like,
Hmm.
the type of aesthetic. Say you live in the woods and you want a woodland aesthetic for your property. Using a
Yep.
rougher material to relate to the context around it may be more appropriate than going with smooth materials. So there's a number of things that play. It really comes down to program and what you're actually designing around, where your project's located, and then ultimately how do you use the space.
Yep.
So pros and cons of rougher materials too that we've found in projects. It's great for that texture, but you can't necessarily move chairs around on it or move
Yeah. Yeah.
tables because you start to rock and you get it's kind of like being at a restaurant and that one leg is off where you
The
start to
one
get
like yeah.
the tipping, right? So you got to strike that balance for where it's appropriate.
Nice. And then sort of to wrap up this talk about the indoor outdoor space, you touched on lighting really quickly
Yep.
when you were mentioning lights and soffits and stuff like that. What's your general strategy for lighting? Not just in a I guess in a general sense, but also in a sense of it's now nighttime and you're inside your house and you still want to experience the landscape. How do you incorporate lighting to accomplish that?
Well, the technology related to lighting and sound right now, it's incredible what you can do with this with the tech on the backside of this.
Hmm.
So what we always recommend is flexibility within lighting and even acoustical design for the property. What I mean by that is depending on if you're having a party or if it's just a quiet night at your property, you want to be sustainable as much as you can, right? But if you're having a party, you
Mhm.
want more light on the back. You want to show off the property. So you can create settings for, it's no different than kind of your higher end cars that you get in, you hit setting one, setting two, right? Depending on
Yeah.
if you're driving or your wife is driving, you create scenes. That's really what they are. You're creating scenes for your property. So if you have a party, you can hit scene one and it'll light up the property in one fashion. Or if it's just, you're home on a casual Tuesday, Wednesday night, you could really just accent pathways and entries and really downplay the lighting on the rest of the property. It'll save you money, but it also gives you the flexibility for the design within the project.
Yeah, that's really important, having those different sort of, scenes that you set up,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. It's really cool what you can do nowadays. In general,
those are
like I mentioned before, you want the lighting to just disappear into the landscape in general. So, small fixtures, keep them small, break them in as many zones as, I'll say the budget will allow. The more you break into the zones, the more transformers. Okay, the more you break it into zones, the more accessories like transformers you'll need.
yeah,
If you want things to dim, the more flexibility you put into the lighting design, the more costly it's going to be. So again, like everything else in this conversation, there's a balance between the budget on the project and what actually you want to take on, even just as simple as lighting design.
yeah. And one of the last things I wanted to mention about lighting, or talk about lighting, is when we're talking about sort of bringing the indoors and the outdoors together, and many people have these, large glazed openings, or these big Nanowall systems. One thing that they don't realize is at night, those giant windows and those giant Nanowalls are just going to be giant reflections of
Yep.
looking back at them. So you actually have to light up the landscape around those areas, so that at night your indoor space is comfortable.
Exactly. Yeah, you have to balance the light outside to inside. It's no
Yeah.
different than, I'll say, like in the morning at my house. If you're out in the driveway getting the kids on the bus, or you look back and you can't see into the house because the windows are dark, right? It's
Yep.
just the way the light's hitting it.
Yep.
But in the evening time, to your point, you basically have mirrors along the perimeter of your property, right? So you've got to balance and really highlight the pieces that you want to see beyond that mirror.
Yeah. Yeah. So adding that lighting out into the landscape sort of make it so you don't have that mirror effect on when you're indoors. So when it comes to, sort of getting back to the beginning of the process of involving a landscape architect and talking about master planning, why don't you, run us through sort of what your approach to master planning a property might be?
Yeah. So again, master planning, we usually work towards a master plan on a property. It's not usually the conversation that initiates the
Yep.
the the project with a client. Usually we get a call and it's like, hey, we want a pool, or hey, we need to realign the driveway, right?
Hmm.
And then, once we were able to schedule a site visit, we'll show up, walk the property with the client, and then you quickly realize, you're hearing comments like, we want this and this and this beyond the original scope that they called you for. And there's also the time element. We want this and this and this, but not now. Like, how can we do this long term? I've worked on more projects than not where the original scope winds up being a piece of the larger puzzle that we're looking to work through or solve.
Yeah.
It's a lot of conversations up front. It's a lot of, again, collaboration, a lot of programming conversations between us and the client to really understand, like, what do you want for the reason you called us for that specific program element, right? But what do you want? What's the vision for your entire property, right?
Yeah.
Again, I mentioned this early in the conversation. You're going to spend, there's a little more time, hours involved up front to develop that overall master plan. But the key thing in a master plan and implementing pieces of that master plan in a sequential order is that you build new elements A, B, C, D in an order, but to build B, you're not tearing apart A. When you
Yes.
build C, you're not tearing apart A and B, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So,
I think you talk about, not being reactionary, right?
yes, yeah. So the more you can be proactive and think ahead on projects, the more money you're ultimately going to save.
Yep.
And I can tell you in every project where we've done a master plan, the client has ultimately saved money by developing that master plan versus just diving in and doing one-off projects year after year after year.
Do you think that, let's say if someone's working on a budget, right? And maybe they don't have the budget to tackle the landscape, all at once, or maybe they don't think that they have a budget that's sort of worthy of hiring a landscape architect for. Do you still think it's a great idea to hire a landscape architect to at least work through the master plan with that client, even if the intent to like DIY these projects over, 10 or 15 years?
I think that's just as important. I've done a handful of residential projects where we don't get the CDs.
Yep.
It's not ideal because, like, I'll just say this quickly
Yeah.
because if the client's hiring a landscape architect, our involvement through the detailed design and ultimately construction oversight on the project, no different than architecture,
Hmm.
making sure those critical complex details are coming together, working with the contractor. If we're only involved with the concept phase, it leaves that whole back end to chance
Exactly.
essentially.
Yeah.
And then it's kind of you're working with the contractor that we're not necessarily familiar with, and they might not be familiar with the type of detailing we're proposing. But a master plan in collaboration, in my mind, with a contractor, there's two ways to phase a project from a master planning standpoint. One is based on program. How much do you want to bite off year to year?
Hmm.
And the second one is, do you want to do it by budget? So there's two different ways. You can basically, I don't know, I'm just throwing out a number. I want to spend 100,000 this year, 100,000 next year, 100,000, the third year out. You
Yep.
can start to work with a contractor, work with the landscape architect to identify that $100,000 block that you can bite off year one, year two, year three. Or, for as an example, I want a pool, right? I want a pool patio around it, cost X. You can isolate that part of the scope, see what it's going to cost. It might take you an extra year to fund it, to come up with the
Yeah.
money for that, but you'll be able to isolate that and then cut that project off in relationship to the larger master plan at a zone that makes sense. So when you go to do that phase two or phase three, you're not disrupting what you already built.
Yeah, I agree on that. And I think that there's other benefits to engaging a landscape architect in helping to create a master plan, and that is they're going to be able to recommend uses for your yard that you might not have even considered. Right? I think we talked earlier, it was mentioned earlier of just like huge swaths of grass and how that's sort of people are trying to get away from that. If you look at a typical suburban house, it might be that grass yard and maybe it has a pool and a patio, or maybe it has a fire pit, and then just, random shrubs around the perimeter of the house. And that's not necessarily what we're talking about here. We're talking about, really creating zones on your property that you can use throughout the day and throughout the year.
Yeah, it's a wall to wall look at the property, right?
Yeah.
And to your point about lawn, right? It's the highest maintainable, element on a property is lawn, right? Everybody likes the green lawn, high
Hmm.
irrigation, high cost to fertilize it and maintain it, right? So it's a wall to wall approach. Again, this all comes down to spending the money up front, right, to come up with a master plan. But ultimately, a piece of that on the maintenance side is if you develop a master plan and you're reducing areas of lawn to maybe a size that you actually need versus what you had prior,
Yeah.
you actually start to reduce maintenance costs for your property, right? So there's
Yeah.
different, it doesn't just come to the design and kind of the space and the scale and materiality. What happens when the landscape architect, what happens when the architect goes away, right? What are you left with? Are you left with a property that's more expensive to maintain than what you previously had?
Yeah.
Hopefully the answer is no. So
Yeah, so I mean maintenance is a big issue, right?
it is.
Um,
Yeah.
so like what are some of the things that you consider when you're talking about long-term maintenance of the landscape?
Well, it all comes like long-term maintenance and costs. A good landscape architect, a good contractor, there's going to be a maintenance plan associated with the design to help educate. Because when you go away, you're going to have questions, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Even if you hire a different contractor to maintain the property, they're going to have questions as well. We always recommend, for example, hand pruning over shearing, right? I know we're bouncing around a little bit here, but
Yeah.
no, but like hand pruning versus shearing yields a healthier plant, but it's also more labor intensive. There's ways in how we could recommend plants for your project that ultimately influence maintenance costs. Again, when it comes to lawn, reducing the amount of maintainable turf, planting with sustainable low irrigation demand plants across the property makes a huge difference as well.
Yeah.
So again, there's ways to reduce the maintenance costs just purely by design.
Yeah, and yeah, that's a great point that if you don't have that professional working with you, then you wouldn't get that expertise.
Yeah, yeah.
Um And, when you talk about maintaining the health of the plant long term, I mean, that's really important because I think a lot of times people don't fully learn or fully understand how to maintain each different type of plant, and that can get overwhelming. And then what happens when you don't maintain it properly and it dies in 2 years? You know?
Exactly. It's a big component. And then, like I said, you get animals want to eat the plants too, right? I mentioned that earlier with deer. So it's not only balancing just the maintenance of it, but making sure you're putting in the right material that will survive. Doesn't require a lot of irrigation, doesn't require a
Yep.
lot of fertilizer. It's a little more complicated than I think people assume it is.
I bet. I bet.
Yeah.
And so when you're talking about these higher end projects, right?
Yep.
These $1 to $3 million sort of landscapes, that the maintenance on that must be, really complicated.
They're significant. Again, we're looking to use low, sustainable materials for those projects. But again, it's just, when you're working on large scale landscapes with the want to have everything hand pruned, not sheared,
Yep.
it's the maintenance undertaking is significant. And also a lot of those properties, they like extensive lawns. So
Mhm.
it all comes down to education and making sure a huge part of, my job, your job is really educating the client on what
Yeah.
we're designing, but what they're left with is not the term, what they're inheriting. They need to understand that, particularly on the landscape side, it's not, install it and walk away. It's a living, breathing
Yeah.
installation, right? Like, so the plants are going to grow. It really comes down to there's these games you can play to make things more affordable. And for a high-end residential job, those $1 to $3 million landscapes, our clients want day one impact, right? You're putting large plant material, large trees in,
Yep.
tight together, right? So they want day one impact. If I had a quarter for every job that got value engineered, the first thing we do is look at plant material
The
and how to
plant
reduce
size.
costs on
Yep.
plantings, right? So the first thing you do is spread the plants out a little more, reduce the quantity of the plants.
Mhm.
And if that's still, an issue, then you reduce the size of the plants. But basically what you're doing essentially is delaying that same planting aesthetic impact 1, 2, 3 years out. That's really what you're doing with it, right? So you're putting smaller plant material in, spreading it out, and that's how you get costs down from a planting perspective.
I'm hearing some good things on how to control a budget on a landscaping project. One is the upfront planning, and even if you're going to space out the projects over multiple years, do it in such a way where you don't have to rip up one thing to accomplish the next thing. I'm hearing plant sizes is a good way to control budget, and again, there's the upfront budget versus that sort of immediate day one result, right? And you have to balance that. If you want that day one result, then you're going to have to pay that extra money for the larger plants. And then number three, what I think people don't really pay attention to that often is the long-term maintenance, right? If you have an extensive landscaping plan, that you're going to have to assume a budget to maintain that, or whether that's in time that you invest yourself or whether that you're hiring a team to take care of it.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. This is literally last week. I had a conversation with a great client of ours, and did a significant install on his property a few years ago, and the property requires a lot of maintenance. But
Mhm.
again, through education, he was very aware of what we were proposing, what was installed. And as a joke, he always likes to noodle me every once in a while. He's like, we go on vacation to hotels, and he goes, "Now I understand why they have a full-time maintenance crew."
Yeah.
He's like, I
Absolutely. Yeah.
basically need this for my property. And we're like, well, yeah, it's, you have that level of an installation on your property. So
Yeah.
again, it's just setting expectations for the proposed design and making sure that aligns with the budget and the finances that you're going to be allowing for the maintenance once, the designers and the contractors go away.
Yeah, and then weighing that against the dream and that you have for how you and your family are gonna use your property.
Yeah, and again, that all comes back to the whole master plan
Mhm.
conversation, because you can layer on top, right? So it's, day one, you could not necessarily throw everything, build everything all day one. You could build on that and layer it. And if you're patient and willing to do it over a few years, you can achieve the same goals
Yeah.
and spread out the finances to make it a reality.
Well, Nick, I've really enjoyed this conversation. Before we go, I'd like to ask you, what is one thing that a homeowner can do to have a more successful project?
It all comes down to collaboration. Every job, it comes down to collaboration. A successful project if you're not collaborating, it's not going to succeed. The projects that have the best chance for success is when all players, that's the designer, contract, and also the client, are working towards the same goal, both short and long term. So it's all about listening. It's not about executing. It's about collaboration.
Great. And one last thing too. I know MDLA is based out of Boston and Connecticut. Do you work outside? And I know you said you do work up in Lake Winnipesaukee area,
Yep.
and the homes up there. How about work throughout different parts of the country? If
Yeah.
people
So
wanted to hire you to work on a project that's remote from these areas, is that something that you guys do?
yeah, so we're licensed in all 6 New England states, New York,
Hmm.
and we just recently acquired Florida. So,
Oh,
and
nice.
the reason Florida, I'll mention that specifically, is because we're starting to get requests for second homes in
Yeah.
remote locations. So what I'll say is, if you've got a property and you want us to look at, and we're not currently licensed in that state, that's something we would definitely,
Yep.
entertain. We're not limited to the states we work in. That's kind of long story short.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a great conversation, Nick. Thank you so much for joining me.
No, I appreciate it. This is fun. Thanks, Chris.